So it is evening and I am out here sitting with my tomatoes, and I wanted to talk a little bit about growing tomatoes in the Pacific Northwest and how it's different than growing them in most other climates, particularly southern climates. Right now, all over YouTube and in blogs, you'll see people harvesting their tomatoes and very excited about the beginning of tomato season, and that's not the reality in the Pacific Northwest. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how it's different and how what the pros and cons are that we get. There's always a trade-off, right? So let's do that. So here are my tomatoes. They are being grown in a high density manner, more dense than I have ever grown them before. I typically have grown them in cages made of weld wire that were great in some respects, but difficult to harvest through. It is difficult to put your hand through the weld wire cage and then grab a big tomato and be able to get your hand back out. And so you had to harvest through the tops of them, which meant I missed tomatoes that were growing at the base of the tomato plants often. So I'm trying growing them up bamboo stakes and pruning much more heavily than I have in other years. I am tying them up, and we'll talk about with what, and then I have marked my varieties with, these are those shipping envelopes, they're that slippery stuff. And I find that I just write on them with Sharpie, and I find that they will last the entire season. So each pole has a tomato on it. Again, this is the first time I've grown up bamboo poles, and it's working pretty well, except for my beds they're only 10 feet tall, and the soil has settled. I do put more compost in them at the beginning of each season, but the soil has settled, and so I don't have a full 10 inches underneath them. There is more bark chips and more soil. However, I don't think I got my poles as deep as they needed to be. This one is falling over, and I am a little bit worried that might happen. I may need to put in some extra stakes and create like tripod-like structures with some of these, which will be fine. But for right now, they're fine. They are tied up to these stakes at about, let's see, where's the next one? 18-inch intervals or 1 foot intervals, just depending. And I talked about this in my garden tour, but I am about a little bit behind because during the big heat wave, they dropped all of my tomatoes dropped all of their blossoms. And for us, that was at a critical point for the tomatoes. And so while I did have some fruit, and you can see there is fruit on these tomatoes plants, but not as much as I would expect. So, but they'll continue to put it on, and that's one of the the realities of growing tomatoes in the Pacific Northwest is our days are not as hot, and it takes longer to grow tomatoes here. So unless you are growing them in a hothouse or under cover of some sort that is getting more heat, you probably, for gardens here, you probably don't have ripe full-size tomatoes yet. Now, of course, there are exceptions to that. I looked back at my notes, and last year my first tomato was this week. I had a ripe full-size tomato this week. It was an Oregon Early, and is the variety. I have grown other early varieties like Early Girl and Abe Lincoln, and I have found that I don't really care for the flavor of early varieties. So I just want my first tomato to just taste like magic. And they just didn't do it for me. So I am not growing early varieties this year. I'll wait a little bit longer to get those delicious, ripe heirloom tomatoes. And I do have to wait longer than gardeners in more southern climates. Now we are enjoying cherry tomatoes here, and you can see this is brownberry. They are not an extremely prolific cherry tomato, but they are my favorite. So it is the one that I grew this year. I am the only real cherry tomato lover in my family, and so I just have one. I wish that I had grown at least one more, but I didn't. I wanted to share with some friends, and so I just kept one for myself that I grew from seed. So some of the things that I do for my tomatoes are they need to get fertilized. They are heavy feeders, and this is the fertilizer that I am currently using. It works. It isn't what I've always used. I used to use fish emulsion, and I still use that in my greenhouse. However, my dogs, there's one culprit right there, they used to, or they will dig up anything that has fish emulsion in it. And so I do use this, and I do not put it on the top. I actually side dress for the same reason, because they will still dig this up. This still smells good to them. But let me show you what that looks like. Hey, you. Are you naughty? Are you naughty? This is River. Oh, are you naughty too? See, they can smell it. And they're like, oh, are you gonna do that? I'm not. Get out of here. Nope. Okay, so the dogs are inside, and this is what side dressing looks like. I'm gonna dig down a little ways away from the plant, from the base of the plant. And then I'm going to don't tell my dogs, I really am gonna fertilize this plant. I put them inside. The instructions are once a month, 2 tablespoons per let's look, for established plants. Containers for, let's see, not new plantings, or add, let's see, 1 to 2 tablespoons per gallon of soil is what it means for the container, into the soil surface once each month during the growing season. 1 to 2 tablespoons per gallon. I don't even know how many gallons this thing is. And obviously in my raised beds, I don't know what that is. That's what I do. It's a handful. I think it turns out to be about maybe 1/3 of a cup. And then I cover it back up, and I'm gonna do the same thing on the other side. So that's how I fertilize, and that is definitely less than what is recommended, so I'm not over fertilizing. I also tend to do it more often. I will fertilize about every 2 to 3 weeks. So back over here in the big tomato garden, I am growing 4 varieties here. They are Brandywine, which I grow every year and I love. German Pink, which I have grown before. They have really delicious flavor. They make big, beautiful tomatoes, but they are not super prolific. Pineapple, which I have never grown before and I am very excited about. And Kellogg Breakfast, which I have also never grown before. And honestly, I cannot remember why I chose it. But hopefully they will, I have high hopes for them. So obviously the con of growing tomatoes in the Pacific Northwest is that you don't get tomatoes as soon as everybody else. And you can, like I said, you can grow them in a greenhouse. I can't grow them in my greenhouse. My greenhouse gets too hot and would kill them. But I could, I could grow them undercover. I could put hoops over my beds, and there are people that do that. I don't feel like the flavor is there, and I am really interested, like my goal with my tomatoes is to have really delicious tomatoes. And I will take fewer tomatoes and later tomatoes in order to get delicious tomatoes. But there are other pros to growing tomatoes in the Pacific Northwest. So for clarity, I have lived in Seattle and I gardened there for several years, and it is very difficult to grow a full-size tomato there to maturity and to get it ripe if you don't grow it undercover or you don't choose an early variety. A lot of people grow cherry tomatoes, and that's all I grew when I lived there. The only gardeners that I knew that got full-size ripe tomatoes in Seattle grew them undercover. So I am not in Seattle anymore. I now live in the Willamette Valley of Oregon, and we get more heat down here, and we can grow full-size tomatoes. They just, like I said, they take longer. The pros are, some of the pros that we get though are, have you seen like everyone, I don't know, it seems like all tomato growers are plagued by tomato hornworms. I have never seen one in my whole life. I've only ever grown in northern climates, and that's not something that we have a problem with here. And why, I don't know, but we don't. And even though we are a somewhat humid maritime climate, and we definitely struggle with powdery mildew in squash plants, I have never had powdery mildew or any other type of mildew or humidity related illness on my plants. I rarely have, this year I am pruning them more extensively than I have in the past, but I have always grown them very close together. These are grown even closer than 18 inches, but I would often grow my tomato plants unpruned 2 feet apart. Often, every time. And I just didn't lose the tomato plants to rot. They will produce tomatoes through my entire growing season until the first frost. I never pull my tomato plants until the end of October. We are very unlikely to get a frost before then, and so I have that extended season. Again, it takes longer, but I don't have to deal with hornworms and or illness from powdery mildew. My garden happens to be in a breezy location, and that probably helps, but it is not something that I hear other tomato growers complaining about either. So there's some benefits: no tomato hornworms, no mildew illnesses from on tomatoes, at least. And the last thing that I want to talk about is some of the tools and like maybe things that I do differently for my tomatoes that from other growers, or maybe they're the same. I tie my plants up with these twist ties. I chose these over, I've tried a lot of different things. I don't like the plastic because I just don't like plastic. I don't like having something that only has a one-time use and then I throw it in the garbage, even if that use is over a full season. These I can let my plants die back and then remove them, and I can get at least 2 years of use out of them. I also find them to be a little bit more flexible than like tomato clips. Tomato clips are meant to be used with a string. I'm not growing on a string. I've also tried the Velcro. I don't like the Velcro. It is just, I can't say for certain why I didn't like it. It wasn't as flexible in size and where I wanted to put it as these are. Pruning, These are not my favorite pruning shears, but they're the ones I grabbed, just regular old pruning shears. I do like the thinner ones, especially when my tomatoes are small. When they get to be this size, it doesn't make as much difference. But when they're small, I like the thinner ones to clip out the suckers that grow in the elbows, and I take those out. And I talked about this for a little bit in my last garden tour, but typically I cut off water to my tomato plants about the second week in July. So we're at the second week in July, and I have not cut off water to my tomatoes. I'm only watering them every other day right now, but I will back that up, and in a couple of weeks I will stop watering them. I'll only water them every 7 to 10 days. And the purpose of that is to stress the plants out so that they will start to ripen the tomatoes, because we just don't have the heat to stress them out and cause them to ripen. And here are my two tomato gardening helpers. Oh, you two. Sit down, Ike. Sit. Oh, be a good boy. Oh, he's a good boy. Oh, he is a good boy. Oh, yes. Okay. All right. And that's it from us. We will see you next time.